Hey guys, Nick here. To me, 2023 was a standout year, so I wanted to give a shout out to a few games that just barely missed my top 10. Enjoy. Okay, I'm gonna start this list off with some spice. I'm not gonna lie, despite the fan backlash and the general attitude towards Starfield these days, it just barely missed my official list. It's a game I'm deep into and have yet to finish, which is perhaps why I ultimately decided to keep it off this list, but the fact remains, I have deeply enjoyed my time with this game. And here's the thing, at the same time, I get why so many people are disappointed or unimpressed. At the end of the day, Starfield is not a seamless, boundless exploration of the universe. It's not a AAA No Man's Sky, even though it certainly aspires to be at times. And for some, falling short of those lofty expectations makes it unremarkable at best. Despite all that, I still found Starfield to be an immensely enjoyable, dynamic, and immersive experience this year. Rather than hate it for what it isn't, I'm simply choosing to love it for what it is. And that's an expansive universe with, in my opinion, a wildly appealing artistic styling, some may call it NASA punk, and one of Bethesda's most interesting backdrops and compelling stories to date. Not to mention, it is without question one of Bethesda's most polished and technically sound games ever made. So to keep it short, the gameplay aspects that I loved about this game the most speak to the variety. This is a game that catered well to my moods in 2023. When I wanted to chill, I could spend hours with my weapons holstered, traveling from planet to planet, taking in the beautiful vistas, harvesting resources, and building outposts that could ultimately help me modify my weapons and my spacesuits. When I wanted something a bit more exciting, I would pursue any number of interesting missions and engage in what I considered very satisfying first-person shooter gameplay that would differ slightly dependent on the gravity and play on the planet and the various powers that I had at my disposal. Powers that I might add were hidden and scattered throughout the galaxy, so tracking those down were a lot of fun. But perhaps it was the game's approach to ship controls and space combat that stayed with me the most. Piloting my custom ship through dogfights in space while routing power to the various systems, sometimes weaving through debris or asteroid fields, was refreshing, and to me it never got old. At least it hasn't so far. But look, at the end of the day, Starfield was, or is, far from perfect. In fact, I would say the same of Elder Scrolls and Fallout. So with that in mind, yes, I definitely disagree with the assessment that this was somehow anything other than another exciting but flawed adventure from the team at Bethesda Game Studios, and I think that's okay. So, hate it if you want, but I'm going to unapologetically enjoy this grand adventure until the credits finally roll. Okay, this one really hurts. Leaving the Talos Principle 2 off my list left me gutted. Its predecessor was my number 3 game in 2014, and to this day, it remains one of my favorite puzzle games ever made. With that in mind, let me be quite frank, the sequel is bigger and better in every sense of the word. At the same time, it's also a game that's incredibly complex in its design, and therefore it's not an easy game to talk about or describe. Thanks to the much bigger world, an abundance of new characters, and the ever-growing toolkit at your disposal, everything about this game feels more impactful this time around. In a lot of ways, it kind of makes the original game, a deeply philosophical 30-plus hour game in its own right, feel more akin to a tech demo that was just waiting to reach its full potential. I think this is, at least in part, due to the first game feeling incredibly lonely. You were a lone android AI traversing a beautiful ethereal plane, solving puzzles in an effort to carry on the legacy of extinct humans. All the while, the only voice you ever heard was this godlike presence from on high. In the sequel, you're the final android to awaken from these trials in the real world after humans have long been extinct, forced to find a place amongst hundreds of other androids in a utopia now called New Jerusalem. Long story short, you find yourself now exploring and solving puzzles in a much more expansive open world alongside an expedition with a group of other androids who all have their own personalities and quirks. The new test chambers in this game are wildly imaginative and full of all kinds of unexpected and devious challenges that are quite honestly impossible to accurately describe. In addition to tools from the first game, you're also given a bevy of new tools like laser beam splitters, inverters, clones, anti-gravity beams, just to name a few. When combined with the expanded lore, stunning visuals, and the bigger world, not to mention the remarkable philosophical quandaries at play in the story, everything about this game feels more ambitious. I could just as easily make an argument for this game being in my top 3 for the year, but it has been that kind of year, where some really tough choices had to be made in the end. Don't let its placement on my list, or lack thereof I suppose, talk you out of playing it. It's a remarkable game that has more than earned its place among classics like Portal or The Witness. Now, I probably need to stop talking about this and move on before I seriously start to question my own ranking, so with that in mind, just listen to me. Go play this game. It's incredible. Don't be a fool. Play it. Okay, at great personal risk, I'm going to go ahead and mention Hogwarts Legacy here, a game that was, one way or another, impossible to miss in 2023. It's a game steeped in controversy thanks to the shitty transphobic attacks from J.K. Rowling that have now hung over this beloved IP for years, as they should. Not to mention the fact that Hogwarts Legacy is a game that, at its core, I feel is deeply flawed. It's far from the best open-world game I've ever played, and it relies far too much on fanservice as a distraction from its myriad of shallow and otherwise repetitive mechanics. But with that said, I want to make sure I mention it here because, if nothing else, it's a solid foundation for a series with incredible vibes, whimsical music, and impressive world building everywhere you look. It's a world that I just love spending time in. In fact, despite its very obvious flaws, I kept coming back to this game for over 80 hours. Hogwarts Castle is massive, elaborate, and full of surprises around every turn. Having the freedom to create a student, choose your house, and roleplay within this space is special, and while it is far from perfect, it still capitalizes on an opportunity to give fans like myself something they've been starving for ages. The chance to attend Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, and have actual agency in that experience too. You can visit Hogsmeade, join the dueling club, enter the Forbidden Forest, soar through the sky in your very own broomstick, attend classes, and explore Hogwarts grounds to your heart's content in an effort to unlock all of its secrets. And for those who don't care about the IP, I don't think it's going to do much. For those of us who have loved and cherished this franchise for a long time, it's something incredibly special. While it doesn't take any of the concepts as far as they could have, not to mention the notable lack of Quidditch for whatever reason, the result is what can only be described as a love letter to fans, made by a group of people who clearly are fans themselves. Now, it's impossible, or perhaps just irresponsible, to talk about this game without at least recognizing the baggage that comes with it. Harry Potter's legacy is unfortunately tarnished by its creator. There's really no way around it. At the end of the day, you're obviously going to have to make your own decision about whether or not you want to engage with it. And at this point, it's been out for a while, so you have a lot more options. As a fan, it was undeniably an important experience for me in 2023. As a critic, I think it needs a lot of work. The inevitable sequel will likely be a huge glow-up, but if we're talking about games that brought us joy over the past year, at a time in which I feel joy is at a premium, there's no way around it. Hogwarts Legacy fits the bill.
It's shameful what you've done to help this.
Sea of Stars was another flawed but wonderfully infectious game that I played in 2023. It's a game that hurts to exclude from my actual list, to be honest, but the truth of the matter is that despite looking and sounding sexy as hell and being a super tight experience with almost no fat, so to speak, the experience wasn't quite deep enough to truly take it across the finish line for me. Now look, part of that might just be me. I just don't hold these retro-style RPGs up quite as high as I did when I was younger. They gotta work harder to hold my attention or do something truly unforgettable with their stories or characters. And don't get me wrong though, Sea of Stars certainly strives for this. In fact, I think it is well above average on both of those fronts. But it was missing something that I can't quite put my finger on. With that said, the packaging and presentation of this world is an absolute feast for the senses. Without question, one of the best looking and best sounding games of the year. It felt amazing to traverse one of those classic isometric open worlds again, especially one as beautiful as this. Honestly, it's a style and structure that I wish AAA Final Fantasy would have returned to, but I don't see that happening. But I digress. The eye candy in this game is relentless. Once you enter a zone from the world map, the environments are every bit as detailed and full of personality. On top of that, it's a story that plays with the concepts of harnessing the power of the sun and the moon, and the world, combat system, and even the soundtrack take advantage of that concept to great effect. Honestly, as you can probably tell, it's really hard to talk about this game without focusing so heavily on the visual style and presentation, and I think that's rather telling. The combat in this game is certainly fun, but I think it lacked the depth necessary to remain truly interesting and engaging for 30 plus hours. Nevertheless, I finished the game and I don't regret a minute I spent with it. Like some of the greatest RPG classics of all time, it is filled with humor, emotion, adventure, and memorable, lovable characters. Even if some aspects fall a little short, I think even being part of that conversation is an accomplishment worth celebrating, so don't let that stop you from experiencing this gem. Yes, I bought a PSVR 2 in 2023. Yes, I know it was probably a poor purchasing decision, and yes, I have only played one game on it so far, making Horizon Call of the Mountain the most expensive game I've played this year, or maybe ever, by a long shot. With that in mind, I can't really say I recommend it as a result, but when you take the drain on my bank account out of the equation completely, Call of the Mountain is another excellent experience in what has become a huge first-party franchise for Sony. It's also another excellent example of what's possible with VR, but in a way that I truly wasn't expecting. That's because aside from fighting huge robot dinosaurs with a futuristic bow and arrow, this is a game about climbing an honest-to-God mountain, which means way more emphasis has been put on creating an insane sense of verticality and scale, and it shows. It put my body to work in ways that I can't help but feel bring it closer to things like Ring Fit Adventure or Wii Fit than I ever expected. Armed with pretty standard climbing equipment, you spend most of your time in this game finding grip points, carefully using your climbing axes to scale near vertical surfaces, and forcing yourself to make death-defying leaps across chasms while being completely enveloped in the space in the way only VR can allow for. This game forced me to face my fear of heights in a safe space while also making my hands sweat and my knees buckle. There's really nothing quite like standing on the precipice of a cliff, knowing you're completely safe, but still feeling your body telling you not to jump. And then jumping. This game is absolutely full of moments like these, but it's also full of breathtaking beauty and intensity of the combat that the series is known for. Not to mention a cool-ass robot dinosaur safari mode that drives home the jaw-dropping scale that is possible in VR in the most spectacular way. At the end of the day, this was another really difficult game to omit from my list, but it's one that I wholeheartedly endorse. If you happen to find yourself in possession of a PSVR 2, of course. In fact, the barrier to entry might be the one thing that kept it from my list in the end. With that said, should the opportunity present itself to you, I can't recommend it enough. I just recommend dressing in gym attire and properly hydrating while you play. You'll thank me later. It's not surprising to me that Resident Evil 4 is the one omission that triggered people when I released my top 10. Is the game somehow disappointing, unworthy, or even unnecessary? Absolutely not. In a lot of ways, like the Resident Evil 2 remake, I think this has become the ideal version to play in the modern era. But at the end of the day, for me, it came down to whether I wanted to rob other, lesser-known games from their time in the spotlight just to heap even more praise on a game that has long since established itself as a bona fide classic. And let's be clear, this remake solidifies that title and digs its heels in even further. Omitting it from my list was one of the key inspirations for making the second video in the first place, because not talking about it in some capacity definitely did feel wrong. So with that in mind, let me gush over Resident Evil 4 Remake for a moment. After the disappointing Resident Evil 3 Remake, 4 quickly reminded me that Capcom stumbles occasionally, but they definitely still have the talent and the sensibilities necessary to remake one of the best action games ever made. Most, if not all, of the modernizations or changes they've made to the way Leon controls in this game feel like improvements. And rather than crafting a one-to-one recreation of the original, every iconic area or zone in this game feels both familiar and refreshing in equal measure. Even brief moments or locales such as that first cabin where Leon meets the Ganado feels bigger, more complex, and a lot more frightening. Which I think is also at the crux of why I adore this remake. My one gripe with Resident Evil 4 has always been that it feels far more action-oriented at the expense of the more horror-oriented aspects the series is famous for. Well, Resident Evil 4 Remake amped up that unsettling atmosphere and the sense of dread dramatically. The game is dripping with the same delicious horror vibes that I adored about Resident Evil 2 Remake, without sacrificing any of the intense action or wackiness that made the original such an unforgettable entry in the series. So for the sake of time, I'll just say this. It was an absolute blast to see all these places, characters, and moments make the jump into the modern age. The game remains iconic, and its reputation for greatness remains completely untarnished. In a year like 2023, I simply couldn't bring myself to use a slot on my list to say what we already know. Resident Evil 4 is, always has been, and will remain an all-timer. Quite honestly, Resident Evil 4 Remake doesn't really move the needle in either direction in that regard, but that's completely okay because it's still an absolute must-play. Well, that's all, folks. I promise I'm done talking about 2023. For now, it's back to the grindstone that is 2024. We hope you'll join us for another year of gaming and podcasting. We record new episodes on Tuesday nights at 8 p.m. Central Standard Time on twitch.tv/4playerpodcast. We hope to see you there. Cheers.